Have you ever wondered if a ship can possess a soul, or if the iron itself can decide that it simply refuses to sink? Most vessels belong to history, but the USS Enterprise belongs to the realm of myth, a gray ghost that haunted the dreams of the Imperial Japanese Navy for 4 long and bloody years. She was the Big E, a steel sanctuary that seemed to carry an invisible shield, surviving when her sisters fell into the dark and crushing embrace of the deep. To the enemy, she was a recurring nightmare that they claimed to have killed 3 times. To us, she was the heartbeat of the American spirit in the Pacific. The fascination with the Enterprise lies in the secret of the supernatural luck, a series of coincidences and narrow escapes that changed the course of human history. My name is a whisper of the salt spray now, but I remember the morning of December 7th when the world turned to fire and we were the only thing left standing. We were the crew of the Immortal, the guardians of a legend that was born in the smoke of Pearl Harbor and ended in the glory of total and absolute victory. The fascination of the morning of Pearl Harbor was the secret flaw of the weather, a heavy storm that delayed our return and kept the Enterprise away from the Japanese bombs. The psychological weight of arriving at the harbor entrance to find the pride of the battleship fleet in ruins was a shock that redefined our very sense of reality. We saw the black smoke rising from the burning hooks of the Arizona and the Oklahoma, a funeral pyre for an era of naval warfare that had died in a single and violent hour. The fascination of our survival was the realization that the Big E was now one of the last few shields between the enemy and the American West Coast. We felt the heartbeat of the turbines, a rhythmic promise of speed and power that gave us the courage to face a horizon filled with shadows and the unknown. Every mile we traveled was a gamble with the abyss, but the Big E moved with a grace that made us believe in the possibility of the impossible. I remember the secret flaw of the early days of the war, the desperate hit-and-run raids where we had to strike the enemy outposts and vanish before their superior numbers could catch us. The fascination of the Doolittle raid was the sight of the massive B-25 bombers on the deck of our sister ship, the Hornet, while we provided the invisible and silent protection. The psychological weight of the point of no return was a physical sensation as we sailed deeper into Japanese-controlled waters than any American fleet had ever dared to go. We watched the horizon for the first signs of the enemy scout planes, knowing that a single discovery would mean the end of the mission and the destruction of our small and lonely force. The fascination of the Enterprise was her ability to blend into the mists of the North Pacific, a gray ghost that was already learning the art of the deceptive and lethal and silent approach. We felt the heartbeat of the turbines, a rhythmic promise of speed and power that gave us the courage to face a horizon filled with shadows and the unknown. Every mile we traveled was a gamble with the abyss, but the Big E moved with a grace that made us believe in the possibility of the impossible. The psychological weight of the Battle of Midway was the turning point where the fascination with the Enterprise's luck transformed into a reality of devastating and precise and overwhelming aerial power. The secret flaw of the Japanese plan was their overconfidence, a belief that they could lure the gray ghost into a trap and finish her once and for all. We saw our SBD Dauntless dive bombers disappear into the clouds, carrying the weight of the nation on their single-engined wings as they searched for the enemy carriers. The fascination of the incredible victory was the 5 minutes of fire that saw 3 Japanese giants turned into burning wrecks by the skill of our pilots and the spirit of our ship. The psychological weight of the loss of the Yorktown was a bitter pill, but it left the Enterprise as the last standing sentinel of the original and proud and heavy Pacific carrier force. We realized then that the Big E was more than a ship. She was a survivor, a vessel that absorbed the strength of her fallen sisters to become something more than iron and wood. We were the masters of the mid-Pacific now, but the road to Tokyo was still long and paved with the fire of the coming and violent and dark storms. I often think about the secret flaw of the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, where the Enterprise was hit by 3 massive bombs that should have sent her to the bottom alongside the ghosts of the deep. The fascination of the damage was the ship's resilience, as our crews fought the fires and repaired the flight deck while the battle was still raging around us in the hot and humid air. The psychological weight of the near-death experience was a jolt of adrenaline, a realization that our luck had a price that had to be paid in the blood of the men on the anti-aircraft guns. We saw the Japanese planes falling from the sky like burning leaves, a testament to the wall of fire that the Enterprise could throw into the heavens to protect her own and sacred and heavy hull. The fascination of the survival was the way the Big E returned to the fight only weeks later, her scars hidden beneath a fresh coat of gray paint and a renewed and fierce and defiant spirit. We were the ghosts of the Solomons, a ship that the enemy claimed was sinking, yet we continued to appear in the very places where they felt most secure and powerful. The legend of the immortality was growing, a story whispered in the barracks of both sides of the ocean. The psychological weight of the Enterprise versus Japan period was the most harrowing and beautiful chapter of the war, when the Big E stood as the only operational American carrier in the entire Pacific. The fascination of the isolation was the sign we hung on the deck, Enterprise versus Japan, a joke that carried the heavy and terrifying truth of our lonely and desperate and proud situation. The secret flaw of the enemy's strategy was their inability to finish us, as we appeared at Guadalcanal and Santa Cruz like a phantom that refused to stay buried in the mud. We saw the Japanese fleet moving with a caution that was born from the fear of the Gray Ghost and her relentless and precise and lethal and angry dive bombers. The fascination of the struggle was the way we kept the planes flying with spare parts from the wrecks of other ships, a mechanical miracle of ingenuity and desperation and grit. We were the thin gray line, a single ship holding back the tide of an empire while the factories of the home shore were still waking up from their long and peaceful sleep. Every day we stayed afloat was a victory of the spirit over the iron, a miracle of the lucky 6 that defied the odds of the sea and the fire. I remember the secret flaw of the night battles, where the fascination with the Enterprise's radar-equipped aircraft turned us into a predator that could strike in the total and absolute and terrifying darkness. The psychological weight of the invisible hunter role was a new kind of power, a feeling that we owned the night while the enemy was blinded by the shadows and the mists of the deep. We saw our night fighters return to the deck in the pitch black, guided only by the faint glow of the landing lights and the steady and calm hand of the Big E herself. The fascination of the technology was the way it changed the nature of the carrier war, making the Enterprise a 24-hour threat that never allowed the Japanese sailors to sleep in peace. We were the eyes of the fleet, a sentinel that watched the horizon with electronic pulses and the sharp and focused eyes of the most experienced crew in the world. The psychological weight of the Endurance was a heavy burden as the months turned into years and the ship's hull grew tired and salt-stained and heavy with the memories of the fallen and the fire. But the spirit never wavered, a flame of defiance that burned brighter with every moon that rose over the silent and dark and open Pacific. The fascination with the secret flaw of the kamikaze attacks was the ultimate and most violent test of the Enterprise's immortality during the final year of the Great and Bloody War. The psychological weight of the Divine Wind was a new kind of terror, an enemy that didn't just want to hit the ship, but wanted to become one with the iron in a final and suicidal and fiery embrace. We saw the planes diving through the wall of our flak, their pilots focused on the Gray Ghost as the ultimate prize for their emperor and their honor and their end. The fascination of the damage was the sight of the forward elevator being blown 400 feet into the air by a direct hit, a volcanic explosion that tested the very limits of the ship's structural and spiritual and heavy strength. The psychological weight of the final wound was the realization that even the Immortal could be broken, as the Big E was finally forced to withdraw from the front lines for the last time in the spring of 1945. We felt the ship groan, a sound of exhaustion and pride, as we sailed away from the fire of Japan toward the safety of the repair docks and the memory of the light. The war was ending, and the Lucky Six had lived to see the dawn of the victory she had done more than any other to secure. I often think about the secret flaw of the post-war era, the fascination with the struggle to save the Enterprise from the scrapyard and the tragedy of our ultimate and heartbreaking and silent failure. The psychological weight of the final decommissioning was a cold silence that felt like a betrayal of the ship that had saved the nation in its darkest and most desperate and lonely and heavy hours. We saw the gray ghost sitting in the mothball fleet, her guns silent and her deck empty of the roar of the engines that had once defined the heartbeat of the Pacific. The fascination of the effort to preserve her was the way the veterans fought for her life with the same ferocity we had used to fight the fire and the enemy and the sea. But the secret flaw of the piece was the lack of funds and the indifference of a world that was moving too fast toward the future to look back at the iron of the past. We felt the psychological weight of the final tow to the breakers, a funeral procession for a queen who deserved a throne but was given a torch and a saw and the dark. The Big E was dismantled piece by piece, her steel recycled into a world that would never know the taste of the salt or the sound of the bombs on her deck. As the first part of our story reaches its end, the fascination with the USS Enterprise remains a study in the soul of a ship and the mystery of the gray ghost that refused to be killed. The psychological weight of her history is the beauty of her legend, a story of how a single vessel stood against an empire and became the immortal heartbeat of a navy and a nation. The secret flaw of her end was the scrapyard, but the secret of her legacy is the flame of the Lucky Six that still burns in the hearts of those who remember the smoke of Midway and the silence of the night. We are the guardians of her spirit, the ones who know that the iron might be gone, but the ghost still sails the mists of the Pacific, a sentinel of the light in a world of shadows and the deep. The fascination of the Enterprise is her permanence, a story that grows stronger with every passing year, a reminder that some things are truly immortal and can never be erased by the torch or the time. We are the crew of the Big E, and our watch is a memory that will shine as long as the sea is blue and the spirit of the sailor is free and the ghost is gray. The fascination with the end of 1942 was the absolute and terrifying isolation of the Enterprise as she became the only operational American carrier left in the entire Pacific Ocean. The psychological weight of this loneliness was a physical presence on the deck, a realization that if the Lucky Six fell, the path to the American coast would be wide open for the enemy's fury. The secret flaw of our situation was the total mechanical and human exhaustion operating in a relentless cycle of launches and recoveries under the scorching sun of the Solomon Islands. We saw the Hornet vanish beneath the waves at the Battle of Santa Cruz, and the silence that followed on the radio was the heaviest sound we had ever heard in our lives. The fascination of our survival was the makeshift sign the sailors hung in the hangar, Enterprise versus Japan, a defiance that was half joke and half desperate prayer. We felt the ship knew its burden, its turbines vibrating with an intensity that seemed to say it would not accept rest until the battle was won. We were a lonely island of steel in a sea of enemies, a ghost that refused to fade into the mist of defeat. I remember the secret flaw of our protection during the Battle of Santa Cruz, when the Enterprise was struck by bombs that penetrated deep into her guts, killing dozens in a single white-hot flash. The fascination of the damage control was the miracle performed by the repair crews, who welded the flight deck back together while the engines of the planes roared above them for the next strike. The psychological weight of operating a ship that was literally burning and listing was a trial by fire for the nerves of the Grey Ghost's veteran crew. We saw the twisted metal being cast into the sea to lighten the load, each piece of steel a part of our home that we were losing to the insatiable appetite of the war. The fascination of the resilience was the way the Big E absorbed the punishment, as if her Krupp steel structure had a memory of survival that bypassed naval engineering logic. We were a wounded ship that refused to bleed to death, a queen stained with oil and soot who continued to hurl her planes against the horizon of fire. Every takeoff was a scream of defiance, a proof that the spirit of the Enterprise was a fire that no Japanese bomb could ever extinguish. The psychological weight of the Guadalcanal campaign was the feeling of being trapped in a maritime meat grinder, where the Enterprise was the only air support for the Marines in the trenches of Henderson Field. The fascination of our role was the intimacy with danger, operating in waters so narrow that we could see the flash of the enemy battleship's guns during the nightly naval duels. The secret flaw of our defense was our vulnerability to submarines, silent shadows lurking beneath the dark waters, waiting for a single error from our captain or our destroyers. We saw the wake of torpedoes passing by a mere few meters from our stern, moments where time seemed to freeze and the heart of the ship seemed to stop beating for an eternal second. The fascination of our luck was the Grey Ghost nickname given by the Japanese, who reported our sinking so many times they began to believe we were protected by supernatural forces. We felt we were shielded by the very mist of the Pacific, a fog of war that hid us at the critical moment and revealed us only when our talons were already upon the enemy's throat. I often think about the secret flaw of the forward elevator, which was jammed in an open position after a hit, creating a giant hole in the flight deck in the middle of an aerial battle. The fascination of the ingenuity was watching the ship's carpenters building a patch of wood and steel in record time, allowing planes to land on what looked like a deadly obstacle course. The psychological weight of every landing was a collective agony, watching our exhausted pilots try to touch down on the unstable deck while the ship maneuvered violently to avoid dive bombers. We saw aircraft crash and explode, turning the deck into a funeral pyre, only to see the deck crews push the wreckage into the sea in seconds, clearing the way for the next hero. The fascination of the efficiency was the result of months of constant terror, a human machine that functioned with the precision of a watch and the ferocity of a wounded predator. The Enterprise was not just a ship in those hours. She was a living organism whose cells were sailors and whose blood was the aviation fuel running through her iron veins. The fascination with the arrival of the new Essex-class carriers in 1943 was the moment the Enterprise ceased to be the lone warrior and became the mentor of the new fleet. The psychological weight of the relief was immense, but there was a secret flaw in our pride, the fear that the Big E would be replaced by the newer, faster, and more modern ships arriving from the home front. We saw the new giants lined up in Pearl Harbor and realized we were the scarred veterans in a sea of young ships untouched by the smoke of defeat. The fascination of our transition was the way the Enterprise continued to lead, not by having the most advanced technology, but by having the soul most tempered by the fires of Midway and the Solomons. We felt the ship had a silent authority, a presence that commanded the respect of every admiral and every sailor who crossed her path in the vast and now crowded Pacific. We were the Grey Ghost, the ship that had held the line when there was no one else, and the fleet knew that our scars were the medals of a nation that refused to die. I remember the secret flaw of the night operations, where the Enterprise became the first carrier to specialize in night fighting, turning the darkness into our greatest and most lethal ally. The fascination of the night owls was the sight of planes taking off into a pitch-black abyss, guided only by the faint glow of the instruments and the absolute trust in the ship's radar. The psychological weight of the darkness was a new kind of tension, a world where the enemy was invisible until the moment our tracers tore through their wings in the silent night. We saw the gray ghost becoming a true phantom, striking from the shadows and vanishing before the Japanese could even register the direction of the attack. The fascination of the innovation was the way it broke the traditional rules of naval warfare, proving that the Enterprise could adapt to any challenge the Pacific could throw at her hull. We were the eyes of the fleet that never slept, a sentinel of the dark that ensured the enemy would find no sanctuary even under the cover of the moonless and cold and deep Arctic-borne currents. The psychological weight of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was the realization that the tide had finally and irrevocably turned, with the Enterprise at the heart of the most massive aerial slaughter in history. The fascination of the carnage was the sight of hundreds of Japanese planes falling into the sea like burning rain, a testament to the overwhelming power of the fleet we had helped to build and protect. The secret flaw of the victory was the sheer scale of the chaos, a sky filled with so much fire and steel that the gray ghost seemed to disappear behind a wall of her own anti-aircraft bursts. We felt the ship vibrate with the constant rhythm of the guns, a song of vengeance for every brother we had lost in the dark days of 42. The fascination of the triumph was the professional coldness of the crew, a group of men who had seen too much to cheer, but who knew that every plane shot down was a step closer to the end of the long and bloody road. We were no longer fighting for survival. We were fighting for the final and total destruction of the force that had dared to strike us at the dawn of the war. I often think about the secret flaw of the ship's internal damage that never truly healed, the gray ghost carrying the twisted frames and the patched plates of a dozen battles into the final year of the conflict. The fascination of her persistence was the way she kept pace with the newer carriers, her turbines screaming with a mechanical effort that felt like a personal pride against the passage of time. The psychological weight of the endurance was a heavy burden on the engineers, who stayed in the sweltering heat of the engine rooms to keep the Big E breathing and moving and fighting. We saw the rust beginning to show through the paint, a reminder that even the Immortal has a limit, a physical boundary to how much fire and salt a single hull can endure. The fascination of the legend was the way it inspired the rest of the fleet, a symbol that as long as the Enterprise was afloat, the victory was a certainty that no storm could delay. We were the backbone of the Pacific, a ship that had become a legend while she was still warm from the friction of the waves and the heat of the guns. The fascination with the secret flaw of the kamikaze era was the ultimate test of our luck, as the Enterprise became the primary target for the suicide pilots who saw her as the ultimate trophy of the American Navy. The psychological weight of watching a plane dive directly toward the bridge was a terror that no amount of experience could ever truly dull or erase from the mind. We saw the gray ghost being struck again and again, her fire control systems shattered and her decks turned into a landscape of burning aluminum and broken dreams. The fascination of the survival was the way the crew refused to let the fire win, standing on the edge of the explosions to save their home from the ultimate and suicidal and fiery end. We felt the ship recoil under the impacts, a series of jolts that felt like the Big E was being beaten by a giant's hammer, yet she remained upright and defiant in the middle of the storm. The legend of the gray ghost was reaching its peak, a story of a ship that the Japanese had killed 1,000 times, but who still rose from the smoke to strike them one last and final time. As the second part of our story reaches its end, the fascination with the Enterprise remains a study in the soul of a ship and the mystery of the gray ghost that refused to be silenced. The psychological weight of her history is the beauty of her legend, a story of how a single vessel transitioned from a lone survivor to the immortal queen of the Pacific Fleet. The secret flaw of her journey was the cost in blood and steel, a price paid by the thousands of men who called her home during the long and dark and violent years of the war. We are ready for the final chapters, for the glory of the final victory and the heartbreaking silence of the scrapyard that awaited the most decorated ship in history. The fascination of the Enterprise is that she is still with us, a ghost in the mists of history, a sentinel of the light that will never truly be forgotten as long as the sea is blue. We are the witnesses to the Lucky Six, and our story is a flame that will burn until the end of time in the hearts of the free and the proud. The fascination with the spring of 1945 was the sense of a grand and violent finale as the Enterprise moved into the shadow of the Japanese home islands for the final assault. The psychological weight of the kamikaze threat had reached a fever pitch, turning the sky into a lethal lottery where every radar blip could be a young man seeking a suicidal immortality. The secret flaw of our defense was the sheer saturation of the air. No matter how many planes we shot down, there was always one more diving through the black clouds of our flak. We saw the gray ghost being targeted with a singular religious intensity, as if the Japanese pilots knew that sinking the Big E would be the ultimate strike against the American soul. The fascination of the carnage was the sight of a kamikaze hitting the forward elevator, an explosion so powerful it sent the 15-ton steel platform 400 feet into the air like a discarded coin. We felt the ship shudder to her very keel, a groan of agony from a giant that had been struck in her heart but still refused to surrender to the fire. I remember the secret flaw of that final wound, a fire that burned so hot it threatened to cook off the ammunition deep within the ship's armored belly. The fascination of the survival was the total instinctive coordination of the crew, a group of veterans who didn't need orders to know how to save their home from the brink of the abyss. The psychological weight of the withdrawal was a bitter and heavy silence, as the Enterprise was forced to leave the battle line just months before the final victory she had spent years securing. We saw the horizon of Japan fading in our wake, a sight we had dreamed of for 4 years, but we were leaving as a broken phantom rather than a triumphant queen. The fascination of the journey back to the States was the ship's personality. She felt tired, her steel weary from the thousands of miles and the hundreds of impacts that had defined her long and bloody life. We were the ghost of CV-6, returning to a world that was already celebrating a peace we hadn't quite reached yet in our own and scarred and heavy and dark spirits. The psychological weight of the end of the war was a strange and hollow disorientation as the Enterprise participated in Operation Magic Carpet, bringing thousands of soldiers home from the ruins of Europe. The fascination of the mission was the contrast, the most lethal weapon of the Pacific now acting as a giant gray cradle for the boys who were desperate to see the Statue of Liberty. The secret flaw of our celebration was the realization that the Big E was now a relic of a vanished era, a ship built for a war that had been ended by the atomic flash and the jet engine. We saw the soldiers sleeping on the hangar deck where our dauntless bombers once lived, their laughter echoing in the spaces where we had once fought for every breath in the middle of the fire. The fascination of the homecoming was the sight of New York Harbor, a forest of lights that welcomed the gray ghost as the greatest hero of the American sea. We felt the pride, but also a creeping dread, a secret flaw in our joy as we realized that a warrior without a war is a target for the budget cutters and the scrap men of the peace. I often think about the secret flaw of the battle to save the Enterprise from the scrapyard, a campaign led by Admiral Halsey and thousands of veterans who believed the Gray Ghost deserved a permanent throne as a museum. The fascination of the tragedy was the political indifference of the late 1950s, a world that was more interested in the future of the space race than the rusted iron of the past. The psychological weight of the death sentence was a betrayal that cut deeper than any Japanese bomb, as the government decided that the most decorated ship in history was not worth the cost of a permanent berth. We saw the funds being raised in nickels and dimes by school children, a desperate and beautiful and failed effort to buy back the soul of the nation's greatest defender. The fascination of the loss was the finality of the tow to the Lipset scrapyard in New Jersey, a funeral march for a queen who was being sent to the executioner's torch. We felt the psychological weight of the silence as the first saws began to bite into the flight deck that had held the line at Midway and Guadalcanal. I remember the secret flaw of the scrapping process, the fascination with how the Enterprise fought her final battle against the very machines sent to dismantle her. The workers at the scrapyard spoke of the ghost's resistance, of cables snapping and torches failing as if the ship was refusing to be broken into pieces for the sake of recycled rebar. The psychological weight of seeing the bridge being lowered into the mud was a vision of the end of an era, a moment where the Lucky Six finally became a collection of parts and memories. We saw the nameplate being removed, the Enterprise letters that had been a beacon of hope for 1,000 days of dark and violent and lonely and heavy sea. The fascination of the desecration was the realization that while they could take the steel, they could never touch the legend that had already been etched into the history of the world. We were the ghosts of the crew, watching our home disappear piece by piece into the furnace of a new and modern and ungrateful world. The Big E was gone, but the spirit of the gray ghost was now free from the iron, a phantom that would sail the mists of history forever. The fascination with the secret flaw of the ship's remains is the way the Enterprise has lived on in the vessels that inherited her name, from the world's first nuclear carrier to the starships of our collective imagination. The psychological weight of the legacy is the truth that the gray ghost never truly died. She simply changed her form to match the needs of a new and evolving and digital and nuclear century. We see the portholes and the deck plates that were saved as relics, sacred fragments of a giant that continue to inspire the sailors who wear the Big E patch today. The fascination of the continuity is the supernatural luck that seems to follow the name, a tradition of excellence and resilience that began in the smoke of Pearl Harbor and continues in the quiet strength of the modern fleet. We feel the psychological weight of the tradition, a realization that we were just one link in a chain of fire and iron that connects the past to the future of the human spirit. The Enterprise is not a memory of the scrapyard. She is a promise of the light that refuses to be extinguished by the dark or the time or the tide. I often think about the secret flaw of the ocean's memory, the way the Pacific still holds the echo of the Enterprise's wake and the sound of her guns at the dawn of a victory. The fascination of the site of our greatest battles is the silence, a peace that was bought by the blood of the men who called the gray ghost their home. The psychological weight of the history is a physical fact that remains unchanged by the passing of the years, or the dismantling of the ship, or the silence of the veterans. We imagine the spirits of the dauntless pilots still circling the mists of Midway, looking for the deck of the Big E to guide them back to the world of the living and the free. The fascination of her state is her eternity, an existence that is no longer tied to the metal, but to the courage and the honor and the loyalty of the Lucky Six. We are the last link to that immortal legend, the only ones who can still feel the vibration of her screws and the heat of her 1,000-degree fire on our skin. The psychological weight of the history is a light that shines on the truth of our survival and the scale of our tragic and monumental and naval and beautiful and absolute success. The fascination with the secret flaw of the Enterprise's story is that she remains the ultimate example of why we name ships, and why we love them like they are part of our own and living and breathing families. The psychological weight of her absence is a hole in the heart of the American naval tradition, a reminder that we must protect our legends with the same ferocity with which they once protected us. The fascination of the gray ghost is her defiance, a story that tells us that even when you are alone against an empire, you can still win if you have the soul of a giant and the luck of the gods. We are the guardians of her final moments, the ones who remember the sound of the wind through her antennas and the smell of the grease on her hangar deck. The fascination of the history is the way it keeps the fire alive, a flame of the Lucky Six that will burn in the dark as long as there are stories to tell and men to listen to the roar of the sea. The Enterprise is a ghost, and we are the haunted, and our watch is a memory that will shine until the end of the long and silent and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final time. As the epic and legendary story of the USS Enterprise and the Gray Ghost of the Pacific reaches its final and quiet end, please consider subscribing for more naval mysteries. We are dedicated to telling the stories of the ships that became legends and the men who lived in the shadows of the most colossal and beautiful and heavy and dark naval triumphs. The fascination with the Big E is a tribute to the power of luck, resilience, and the incredible and silent price of being the most decorated ship in the history of the world. Comment below, was it a national tragedy to scrap the Enterprise, or did her secret flaw of damage make her end an inevitability of the piece? Share this story of immortality and survival to help us keep the memory of the Gray Ghost alive for a new and curious and modern generation of history seekers. Your support allows us to explore the secret flaws of history and bring the heroic phantoms of the deep back into the light of the modern and busy and noisy and living world.